It has been such a pleasure listening to everybody speak, and it has been so amazing being here, not only because I got to reconnect with Black, who used to be one of my students very, very long ago. It's been so amazing meeting him and meeting everybody else, but I love the fact that I was able to bring my husband and my son here today with me, because I very rarely get to show them what I actually do for a living. And I think this is such an important conversation. So I want to say, first of all, that I'm very aware of the fact that I'm speaking from a place of white privilege as I'm sitting here. Okay? It's important for me to acknowledge that. And it's important for me to acknowledge that because I want to speak about language and power. And I have never been in a situation where my language has been questioned. I have never been in a situation where I have had to fight for the recognition of my language. Because my mother tongue is Afrikaans and my second language is English. And neither of those languages have ever been contested in South Africa. Under the previous regime, Afrikaans was the language of government, and currently English is the language of government. I've never had to fight for my language to be recognized. I've never had to fight to access language in my education in my mother tongue. I've never had to fight to find resources, educational or any other resources, in a language I can understand. I'm also in a very privileged position that my husband and I was able to adopt a child of another culture, of another race, that has given me an insight into living as a person of another color in a white community, and the challenges that brings, of having to fight for your place in the community, the white community, the English community, the Afrikaans community, as a person of color, as a person of the LGBTQI+ community. And I want to make that very clear, that I am aware that what I'm about to say could at times sound incongruous, but that I am not with what I look like, but that I am not unaware of the struggles that people have faced in this country and continue to face in this country, and that I can count myself very lucky that I have never really had to face any of those struggles. Right. So that being said, when I was invited to speak here, I didn't really know what to talk about. Because, the problem is when people tell you can talk about anything, then all of a sudden you can talk about anything. And that's a bit problematic, right? So, language change was kind of the topic that was given to me, or language evolution, which is very broad, but finally I thought, let's talk about language change and power. Because if we are talking about Gen Z, we are talking about a generation that is uniquely positioned to use their lingo, to use language, to use the power of language in a way that perhaps previous generations have not been able to. So I want to ask you to join me on a short historical journey. I promise I won't be long. Through some heavy subject matter, perhaps, to bring us to a point where I want to add on to what Black has said and what you have said about the power and the energy and the direction that Gen Z and their lingo is taking. So, the American linguist, author, and philosopher Julia Penelope famously said, and I quote, "Language is power, in ways more literal than most people think. When we speak, we exercise the power of language to transform reality. Now I want you to think very carefully about that. The language that each one of us uses every day, the language in your WhatsApp messages, the language you use with your family, the language that you speak to your friends, the language that you use to speak to yourself. That language creates a reality. Right? Let that sink in for a minute. Your words are not just words. Your words are creators and shapers of different realities. So there is an adage that says, sticks and stones may break my bones, but words can never hurt me. And this has never, ever made sense to me.
Me too.
Because is it not true that the words spoken to us by others can hurt us and change us and shape our realities in ways that stay with us forever? Right? Bruises can fade, cuts can be stitched up, but the realities those words can create can live with us for the rest of our lives. What is the difference between a person who is told every day, you are brilliant, and a person who is told every day, you are a failure? The reality that those words create. That is the power of language. The way parents speak about their children and to their children. The way we speak to each other, about each other, to ourselves, about ourselves. On a micro level, you can already see the power of language. And in our country, we can see the different realities that were created by language, by the power of language on a macro level as well. I want to just give you one example. So in our country, there's a lot of discourse about certain people being colonizers and certain people having been colonized, and colonialism and colonialities and colonization and decolonization. And many people get very offended very quickly when you call them colonizers. Many people don't even want to talk about decolonization. Many people refuse to believe that colonization is even a part of our history. And it is true that we need to use these terms with sensitivity, and we need to use them correctly. Okay? But we also need to keep in mind that it is those who dictate history, those who dictate the language of history, that hold the power to revise history in specific ways. So, you may know that there was a huge war that was waged in South Africa between 1899 and 1902, and for many decades this was called the Anglo-Boer War, right? Why was it called the Anglo-Boer War? Because the historians who wrote the history books, who held the power of language in their hands, were English and Afrikaans historians. Anglo, English, Boer, Afrikaans, those were the people who wrote the history books. That is why the Anglo-Boer War was called the Anglo-Boer War. The title was given to the war by Afrikaans and English historians who wrote the history books of the 20th century. And because during the apartheid regime, the power was with the government to narrate history as they saw fit. They could tell the story of this war as that of the oppressed Afrikaner nation fighting to keep their land and the British invaders trying to steal it. By the way, I call myself a non-practicing Afrikaner, if you were wondering. So this narrative, along with the name of the war, conjured images of brave white men sacrificing their lives to protect the Afrikaner heritage and their future against the colonizer. But what this controlled narrative and title of the war did, however, was to completely ignore several facts. For example, that A, the voortrekkers themselves, the Afrikaners, were the descendants of Dutch colonizers. B, the land they fought to protect and to safeguard for their future generations was not theirs, but was claimed by them in bloody wars with the indigenous peoples of South Africa. And C, that many black and colored South Africans also fought and died in these wars, along with the women and children of all races who perished in the concentration camps. And thus, after 1994, when the power of the government shifted, and only much more recently, this war has started being referred to in scholarship as the South African War, to acknowledge the fact that it was not only the Afrikaner and the British who were involved in this war, that rather it was much more complex, based on racial inequality and heteropatriarchal power structures, and that there were other narratives related to the war rather than the revisionist one communicated in the language of those in power in the 20th century. So this is one example of how language adapts to power changes and how language speaks to power and vice versa. What is important to understand further is that language, and I think we're all aware of this, has long been used as a tool for control by colonizers, by governments, by so many people. And I use the example of the British again, because at one point in history, the British colonized 2/3 of the world's countries. I mean, think about that. 2/3 of the world was colonized by the British. So wherever the British colonized, they followed a very well-established plan. They even wrote books on this. Like, if you want to establish a colony, this is the way to do it. So you start off by severing family ties. Send the adults to perform labor, but split the husbands and wives. And send the children into schooling to become civilized in the Western sense of the word. That means teaching them English. Right? It was a requirement to learn English, which is one of the reasons, and you spoke about this a lot, why English is so widespread over the world today, and also why there are so many variations of this language. And because once the colonizer had broken up families, they could also start dismantling cultures by forbidding traditional and religious practices, traditional clothing, traditional music, and even indigenous languages. And in this way, cultural genocide took place. By using language, the colonizer could also make the colonized understand their proper place in society by calling them natives or naturalized, by changing their given names to English names, by changing the names of their countries from Zimbabwe to Rhodesia, by changing the names of the countries, like I said, and by teaching them just enough English to be functionally literate enough to become laborers, but not enough to empower or educate themselves and others like them. The colonizers used the power of language to create a new reality for colonized individuals, where these persons were subhuman and unable to rise in the social or intellectual hierarchy to positions of power. And that links for me to what Ndi also said earlier. The way that people feel about their languages often have so much to do with shame. Shame because they were told that your language isn't a proper language. It isn't worth valuing your language. Why is it that all our academic texts are written in English? Why is there no scholarly publications in isiZulu and Setswana? Because these languages were oppressed for so long that they never developed into fully fledged academic languages. And that people think that writing academic research or even literature in these languages is not as good as publishing in English. So is it true that sticks and stones only can break my bones, but words can never hurt me? How true does that ring in terms of the context I've just given you? And where does this leave us today, more than 100 years after the South African War? Currently, we are involved in discussions on decolonizing language in the classroom and in education. The CAPS curriculum, that Ndi also spoke about, emphasizes that teachers should embrace indigenous languages and teaching practices. Research advocates for the Africanization of curricula and scholarship. But unlike English and Afrikaans in this country, our 10 other official languages were never given the opportunities to develop in their own right as academic languages. Teaching, learning and research terminology in languages such as isiZulu and Sesotho are just now starting to develop. These languages were oppressed and negated to such an extent that studies indicate that even native speakers of these languages deem them inappropriate for educational or research purposes. And how saddening is that you think my own language is unworthy to write in, to speak in. Sorry. Except for lower grades, school textbooks are not written in official languages, apart from Afrikaans and English, despite the Constitution ensuring children access to education in their mother tongue. This is basically not accessible after grade 4, when they need to switch to Afrikaans or English education. And above all this, student teachers are still being educated in either Afrikaans or English and being taught Eurocentric teaching practices. Research and scholarship need to adhere to Western writing conventions, and there is limited room for publishing research conducted in languages other than English or by using indigenous research practices. And as such, there is debate about using language to empower South African youth and developing language in the country, while the entire debate is simultaneously constrained by the language that has developed for the very purpose to conduct the debate. So now you may ask, okay, well, nice chat about history and thanks for the downer and great, but so what? How is all of this related to Gen Z and their lingo and everything that we've discussed today? So this context that I've provided you with shows the intersection currently between language and power, education, decolonization, the legacy of coloniality, and language in South Africa. And it is at this intersection that Gen Z is so important. I know you are criticized by older generations for your slang, for your language, for the way you behave, for the way you dress. And guess what? It happened to all of us. All our generations were subject to criticism from the generations before us who told us, we don't understand what you're saying, we don't like your music, we don't like the way you dress, we don't understand you, what is going on. I promise you, when I was in Standard 1, which is now called Grade 3, and I told my mom, Kawabanga dude, which you probably don't even know where it's from, she looked at me like I was an alien. And that was also the time of the Satanic Panic, remember? So anything we introduced that was new, they told us was Satanism.
That's so true.
So the Ninja Turtles and the Smurfs and even Liverhaxy was satanic, right? So Older generations will complain and they will ask you, what is skibidi? They will ask you, what is riz and can I eat it for breakfast? But it is a generational issue. And I was laughing earlier because the moment you said LOL is a Gen Z term, and I thought, no, it's a millennial term. We came up with that. And when you said, what was the other thing that I told you about? When you said BTW, did you say BTW for by the way? And I was like, no! Girl, when there were online chat rooms, when I was the first year at varsity, we did BTW, BRB, ASL, age, sex, language. That's what it was called. BRB, be right back. You know, we invented those things. And then I thought, like, that comes back to my earlier question of, is it out of respect for the previous generation or out of criticism for the generation? But that just shows you the evolution of language. We don't appropriate, we integrate out of respect, and that shows you the evolution. But the issue lies in overcoming the communication barriers inherent in the linguistic gaps between our, that the uniqueness of our lingos create. Unlike the colonizers, we shouldn't be content with mediocrity, of understanding just enough to get by. We should strive for clear and open communication as much as we can, because there is, like Monyè said, an aspect of confusing the enemy, and we get that, okay? But this is important not only for fostering good relationships with our friends and families, but also for your academic futures. Your generation, Gen Z, is the one who is going to have to take up this debate on decolonizing language and decolonizing the classroom and decolonizing English. Your generation is also uniquely positioned to acknowledge linguistic diversity, to integrate it and develop inclusive terminology. You have access to social media and to globalization in a way that no generation before you ever had. Because perhaps the issue is not so much decolonizing the language that we have, but adapting language in such a way that it becomes more accessible and more inclusive. That it's not so much about what is going to become of academic language, but how can we adapt to include Gen Z and transform the language of academia to something that is more inclusive and less restrictive than what we currently have, also taking into account the indigenous languages of South Africa. So inasmuch as language can be and has for so long been a tool of control and domination, you are the generation that has the ability to make language a tool of liberation. And that is the power of language for Gen Z that our generations did not have. Thank you.
Oh, wow.
Questions? Questions, comments?
I have a question.
Yes.
So, when you said like the people who run language runs history, right? How many times in history has that actually happened where like a certain narrative has been pushed?
As long as history books have existed, this has happened. If you go read the history books that we were prescribed when we were in school, the narrative that was given was, for example, the brave Voortrekker Afrikaners fought against the Zulu people, because the Zulu people were the bad guys, not the Voortrekker people were the invaders who basically took the land. If you read the history books now, that narrative is very different, okay? So we need to always be aware that those who control the language, those who are in power, they control the narrative. That is what propaganda is. I mean, if you go read Mein Kampf that Hitler wrote, the narrative that he gives is a very different narrative than the one you read now about the Second World War. So history is always written and rewritten, and that is why there's a big debate about how much of history is fact.
Exactly what I wanted.
And what people say, what people write in their memoirs and their autobiography, something like memory is fallible. No one's memory is 100% accurate.
And perspective.
And perspective. How much of what we read in the history books are actual facts? Because everybody who wrote that down wrote it from memory and recollection. So unless you have, like we do now we have like evidence in terms of photographs and videos, but even that can be tampered with.
No.
So it begs the whole question of what is real, what is not real, and who narrates what reality is. It becomes a whole philosophical debate if you go into it like that. Yeah.
Okay, awesome. Thank you.
No problem.
Any more questions?
Yeah.
No, I'm just going to make a comment. I hear a lot of stories of hope, and that's what I like about Gen Z. And if I look at Afrikaans, as an official language, it's merely been here for 100 years. And it developed, obviously, because of power relations and that. But I think that African languages, with the internet and AI, has now time to leapfrog. You know,
exactly.
To go forward where no generation has gone before. So I've got a lot of hope for these languages to be preserved, to be archived, and in a much greater speed than what we have done. So
yeah, and that's the hope. I mean, a lot of the research on the decolonization of English and decolonization of the curriculum is about the fact that, for example, the creation of academic terminology, for example, hasn't happened in many indigenous languages because, okay, it's kind of an evil cycle. The lexicographers and terminologists to record and develop the language didn't exist because the language didn't develop in that way, because the lexicographers and terminologists didn't exist. So it's kind of that evil cycle. So I was delighted the other day that on LinkedIn I found someone had posted a picture of Sesotho terminology for things like methodology, hypothesis, theoretical framework, those things. So that is starting to develop. So the minute you can start developing that and kind of officializing it, so they're calling it the intellectualization of indigenous languages, which I don't like. I don't like it at all because that kind of indicates that it's not an intellectual language to begin with, which is crap. But anyway, to use the official terminology, the intellectualization of the indigenous languages, the moment we can start moving toward that, and that's why I say the role of Gen Z is so important. Because much of the millennial and Gen X generation, our hands were kind of tied because of the regime we were under. And now the kind of freedom to use the power of language for that liberation of our indigenous languages is becoming ever more important. And as the government becomes more aware of things like preserving the Khoisan language and preserving our other indigenous languages, that is what's going to become more and more important. And so it's important that we make Gen Z aware of their role in taking this forward. Because we are not going to be around to fight this battle long enough. So we have to hand over the reins to them.